Unholy Death Knight just got buffed, and that's great because Unholy is doing damage. How much damage? That much damage, and a lot more. And obviously Unholy is also a cool spec that you can main, and we're going to convince you that maining Unholy is a good idea. Why? Well, let's talk about why. And listen, watch this video clearly, like and subscribe and all that YouTube thing, and also check our podcast that we had with the big brain lads, Biceps and Taze, on our channel, also talking about Unholy as well. And mind you, that was before the awesome buffs that Unholy got, which are kind of relevant when it comes to deciding what to main and why main Unholy. As long as you're gonna do a lot of damage, is puzzle box an issue? Well, I don't know. But we're not gonna talk about that many specific things, and instead let's talk about what Unholy is as a spec for you new players or people who haven't played it in a while and kind of want to get into it. First of all, if you have never played Unholy, or maybe you kind of forgot and you want to make sure that your know-how is still up to snuff, Unholy is a melee DPS that specializes in disease builds, pet builds, a combination of both, and shooting a lot of its stuff from range, which is kind of cool, really, if we're talking about, let's say, a raid scenario where you kind of have to walk away from the boss for various reasons. So you want to make sure that, you shoot your stuff and you can still have uptime on the boss, and that's definitely impossible with Unholy. To start things off, you have a couple of resources, 2, 3, 1, I don't know, but let's talk about them one at a time. First of all, Runic Power, which is the, the rage, the mana, the whatever you want to call it, that's generated by using a sort of abilities, stuff like Festering Strike, Scorch Strike, and things like that, and it's usually consumed on Death Coil or Epidemic. Which, a Death Coil is the single target, blow your target up with like a coil of a phantom skull, a flaming cranium, I don't know, man. You just shoot it at the enemy and they take damage. Plus, it also augments a bunch of your other abilities, like Gargoyle, which we'll talk about it in a second. The second kind of resource are the runes, the Unholy runes. You have 6 of them, and they usually are necessary to use certain abilities, stuff like Festering Strike and Scorch Strike. You cannot really use them if you don't have runes, and essentially the kind of way it works is you use runes to generate runic power. So the abilities that consume runes are abilities that generate runic power, and abilities that consume runic power can proc your passive runic corruption, runic attenuation, I don't know, there's been like 2 or 3, runic empowerment, there's been like a bunch of stuff, doesn't matter, they're all passive, they're in the talent tree, you're gonna get into them anyway, doesn't matter. But what's important is that every now and again, when you consume runic power, you proc faster regen on your runes, because your runes regenerate 1 at a time, up towards 3 that can generate at a time. Well, if you have all of them consumed, only 3 will be generating at a time, right? Is this still a thing? It's probably still a thing. And when you consume runic power, you also accelerate this even more, so it kind of flows into itself eventually, kind of, maybe a little bit, so it makes sense, as that's what they told me. But that aside, there's also kind of a third resource, although it's, kind of like a pseudo resource. It's basically your wounds, which right now they're not that important, but a little bit important. They're not that important in the sense that you don't really have to bother too much doing them. So wounds usually are generated by pressing your Fester Strike, main source of putting up runes on your target. Your pet with infected claws can also put festering wounds on your target, and Unholy Assault also puts 4 wounds on your target, which these are good because when you pop them, you deal extra damage. I think you also generate extra runic power, but that is not important. What's important is that with a specific talent called Fester Might, when you pop a wound, you get extra strength. And even more important, maybe, Apocalypse, which is an ability, which is a cooldown, consumes wounds up to 4, and based on how many you consume, hopefully 4, you spawn skeletons that will blast your enemy with a lot of damage. Plus you do damage, so that's also really good. So you kind of want to have wounds every now and again, and there's other talents that make you explode wounds in AoE. I'm not gonna go into too many nitpicky stuff. You can definitely find that out in a guide that we may or may not do on Unholy. Not the point. The point is Unholy is cool. And with that out of the way, we can go into the cooldowns, because there's a lot of them, and Unholy rotation is basically you using all of them at once. So where people start to do their combust, their dragon rage, their symbols of death or vendetta, there's no more vendetta anymore, it doesn't matter. When people do their thing, you are popping cooldowns, and when they're done doing their things, you're still popping cooldowns. And when you're done popping cooldowns, you're gonna be popping more cooldowns. It's pretty much how Unholy playset revolves around. But it is cool that you have a lot of cooldowns. Stuff like Dark Transformation, which is maybe the most iconic one, transforming your pet into a big beast that will slap your enemy really hard. And you have the Apocalypse that I mentioned before that just spawns more undead that you use to blast your enemies with. You have Unholy Blight that will essentially spread your diseases around you and make your pets do extra damage. I think it still does that. To your target, you have Army of the Dead, maybe the most iconic DK cooldown ever, where you spawn the Army of the Dead, which is a lot of ghouls and a lot of skeletons that just do a lot of damage. And you've probably seen these things in such episodes as Unholy uses PI to blast the boss to smithereens. That's usually mostly done with Army of the Dead, which is nuts. It's really good. You have Unholy Assault that I mentioned earlier that you have to talent into, and you blast your target with 4 runes. You get a bunch of damage as well, attack speed as well, I believe. Yes, that changed so many times. I don't know which version we're still using anymore, but it is Unholy Assault. Really good. It's not attack speed, it's 20% haste. It's fine. And last but not least, am I forgetting one? I don't think so. You have Gargoyle, which it's something that Unholy hasn't been using for a lot of expansions in recent years, and now it is using, and Gargoyle is a burst in single target. Basically, when you have Gargoyle up and you spend runic power, you empower that Gargoyle that does more and more damage, and it just makes the whole theme of being the commander of the Army of the Dead come alive. And obviously you have a bunch more cooldowns in the class tree for Unholy with Empowered Boom Weapon, Abomination Limb, Soul Reaper, and all of that, which is great. Actually, there's quite a few things that you can get with Unholy if you so desire, and we did mention all the pets and all the diseases. Basically, the Festering Wounds and the Virulent Plague are your diseases, especially if you play with Super Strain, which is a talent at the bottom of the talent tree, which you probably will be playing in AoE still because you are playing with it now. You put all of the plagues from all of the 3DK specs up on the target, so you basically just pick also the Plaguebringer talent that just makes the plagues deal so much damage. So you do have that playstyle, you have the files, you have a lot of tools and a lot of fantasy to go into Unholy and to make you come alive as this. I guess the best way to call it is the reason why WoW is never gonna get a Necromancer class, because you have Unholy as the warrior Necromancer of World of Warcraft, where you summon all of this stuff. So this is kind of how the Unholy goes, but you'll probably do better by actually loading up your character and looking at the talents and builds and all of the stuff that's happening online and checking the Accuracy Discord. But what does Unholy actually do? Well, as I mentioned, in single targeted and raids where it really shines, especially if you get Power Infusion, but not even, you don't even need Power Infusion, it's still good. So you're not gonna get Power Infusion next patch, it's fine, it's over, get over it. You spawn a lot of dudes and you bash your boss to Kingdom Come and you do a lot of damage with builds. Outside of you popping all of your cooldowns, the rotation is fairly simple. You may or may not use Fester Strike to make sure that your target has wounds up, and you burst those wounds with Scourge Strike, generating damage and runic power, and you spend that runic power on Death Coil if it's only one target, or Epidemic if it's AoE. Just remember that Epidemic only hits the targets that have Virulent Plague on them. Virulent Plague is your debuff, your dot, your plague, which you can spread with Outbreak to a clumped up set of mobs, or you have to spam it if you really want to. That kind of sucks if you have to spam it, or with Unholy Blight, which for its duration spreads Virulent Plague on everybody around you, and then you can Epidemic forever, or as long as you have Runic Power and Virulent Plague. So that's kind of how it plays. In AoE, you gather all of the mobs, you pop your cooldowns, and then you kind of do almost the same thing, although you probably might not use Fester Strike that much, since in AoE, the majority of your cooldowns, if let's say everybody has Virulent Plague on them, which they should, you have a Death and Decay up, which could be Defile if you talent into it, and you probably should, because it's really good, it gives you extra mastery, and a bunch of other stuff, lets you hit your Scourge Strike on a bunch of targets. You'll probably Scourge Strike an Epidemic back-to-back for as long as the targets are alive. So the rotation is actually fairly simple, and you can probably break Unholy into two parts. It's the setup part, which requires a lot of cooldowns, depending on whether or not you're in single target or an AoE, and whether or not you have talented into them, because you really, I mean, you don't really have the talent into them, but you probably should if you want max damage. So it's setting up your cooldowns, making sure that everything is prepped, and then the actual rotation, which is actually fairly simple. It goes on the same way. You generate wounds, you pop wounds, you get runic power, you spend runic power, then you generate wounds, you pop wounds, you get runic power, you spend runic power. That's pretty much it. It's fairly simple outside of the cooldowns, and once you get past that, you'll actually see that Unholy is actually fairly cool, because at the end of the day, it's still a DK spec, and it has all the cool DK stuff, you know, the AMS, which makes you immune to magic damage and also absorb magic damage. It also gives you runic power, which is also pretty cool. The Icebound Fortitude that makes you immune to stuns or break stuns, or, you know, just take less damage, which is pretty cool. Also, you have Abomination Limb that just takes all the targets from everywhere and then bring them to you, because why chase targets when you can just grab them? That's cool. That's DK. Not to mention, I did mention the range stuff. Obviously, Epidemic and Death Coil are range abilities. And you can also talent it to Clawing Shadows that I mentioned that essentially makes you use your Scorch Strike. It replaces Scorch Strike and you can use it from range, which is good because sometimes you just cannot hit the boss because you're not in melee. And that probably gives you more range than any other DK spec, than probably any other melee spec, because not even Survival, oh my god, I forgot the Survival is in the game. Not even Survival is playing Aspect of the Eagle anymore. So there you have it. Unholy is looking really strong, especially after the buffs, because there is some, or at least there was some doom and gloom about Unholy in the next patch. It's looking definitely better with the buffs, so it's really cool to know that the devs are still on top of the spec, especially one that's been very, very, very reliant on Puzzle Box as one of the items and a lot of Mastery Infusers. Now that's not going to be the case in the next season, so it's looking pretty good. It's still a strong raid spec, it's a strong AoE spec. It has probably one of the biggest AoEs in the game. It has probably one of the biggest single target in the game, augmented by specific cooldowns and setups. So that's probably, you know, the flavor of it. But what do you think? Are you going to main Unholy? Tell us now. If not, are you gonna main Frost? But Unholy is so much better, and that's not just because it's about this video. Well, with that out of the way, thank you, patrons, for supporting the content, making sure that this is possible. Of course, this and all other videos, and of course, viewer, I'm saying of course too much. If you like to support our content a little bit more and want to see more of these videos, you can consider checking the Patreon link down in the description. It definitely helps us out, makes this possible, because, you know, it's trying times, but we love what we do and hope you love it too. See you next time. Bye-bye.
I've been loving it then, I still love it now. Still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. Getting better every day, let me show you how. Cause still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. It's getting harder to stay, but at the end of the day, it's a guilty pleasure, so just log in and play. Whether it's classic or retail, I'ma do a /bow. Still, I play